Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, and more specifically, Happy Holidays from Classic Gaming Today. Like we did last year, I am going to release a free Patreon expansion pack episode as my gift to all of you during this holiday season. I hope everybody has an amazing holiday filled with family, friends, love, gifts, and everything else that the holidays can potentially bring. And hopefully, you all enjoy listening to this free expansion pack episode, which originally released back on September 11th of this year. This episode is focused on the modern game Disco Elysium, and is effectively the same kind of CGT formula that we do for our normal podcast, but applied to a modern game. This is important for a couple different reasons. For one, Disco Elysium is a pretty darn good game, and number two, it represented the very first time that a Patreon patron sponsored a Patreon expansion pack episode. This episode on Disco Elysium was sponsored by ISO back in September. So sit back, relax, grab your favorite cup of eggnog, hot chocolate, or whatever else you enjoy. Enjoy this episode, and I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. From me to you, happy holidays. Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today Expansion Pack, where we take an expanded look into the classic games and technology that continue to shape the gaming experiences we all know and love today. This is our Patreon exclusive podcast that's meant to build on, but not copy, the traditional CGT formula. This is where we experiment with different kinds of topics that might be beyond the scope of CGT. We might do list episodes, we might do ranking episodes, we might explore alternate dimensions, we might have recaps of totally virtual Olympic Games, or we may take a look at a modern classic, and that is exactly what we're going to do today as we talk about Disco Elysium, a role-playing game developed and published by Zaum and released for most modern computer and console platforms, including Windows, Mac, PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Xbox Series S and X, and the Nintendo Switch in late 2019, with an even more full-featured revised Final Cut Edition coming out in 2021. We are going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 30. I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions. You guys know the drill. You can reach out in any number of ways. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. We have our Discord server, and of course, there is always Patreon. Feel free to reach out in any way you like. I will be there. Before we continue, I do want to mention that this Patreon episode is actually a very special episode because it is our first Patreon-sponsored Patreon episode, meaning this is our first expansion pack episode that is actually sponsored by one of our patrons, that being ISO. ISO did send in a message for me to read for all of you, but we're not going to get to that just yet. We're going to do that once we get into the main game talk in a little bit. Before we do that, as we always do, I want to give you a little bit of a peek behind the scenes as far as what's going on with the podcast, what I've been working on, and just basically what's going on around here. So, at the point of this recording, it is August 29th, which means it's a little bit over a day after the CGT Olympics episode was released on our expansion pack feed. Well, that was an experience to create that episode. I think you guys all know that I tend to want to do some fun things. I like being a little creative with stuff. And when I finally decided, and this was probably a week, maybe a week and a half before the Olympics were set to complete, I thought to myself, hey, it might be cool to do an Olympic rundown episode, to actually do a recap of all of the things that happened across the course of the CGT Olympics, talk about the various events and the winners and all that kind of stuff. And then I started thinking to myself, well, if I'm just going to do a regular recap kind of thing, it might be a little boring. It's like everybody's played the games, everybody competed in the competition. You guys know what happened. So that's where I came up with the concept of maybe making it a little bit more lively by introducing some new characters to the CGT community. And I have to say, I had a ton of fun doing those characters. I hope it wasn't too corny for everybody. I probably enjoyed myself way more than I should have doing those characters between Luigi and Ricky and Winston. Or it was Winston, right? Winston, Philip Stockton the fourth. Yeah. And Mac Piper, the Toothless Avenger. I had fun. I had fun making those characters and doing the voices for them. I hope everybody enjoyed them and didn't think, oh, geez, this is just the most cringe thing ever. I tried to make it fun, and I know I had fun. I hope everybody else did too. I hope you all enjoyed the Olympics episode, because it was definitely very different than the kinds of episodes that we normally do, which obviously is more, I'll say, normal than that. But hopefully everybody enjoyed that one. It took a little bit of time to do. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to dub themselves talking to themselves like multiple times. It's not the most straightforward experience, and to actually make the conversation feel semi-natural, which I don't know if I fully got there. I tried to make it feel as natural as possible from like a interview perspective, but to try to do that took a little bit of time between the recording and then making sure the right inflection happened at the right points and the right dialogue cut off at the right points to make it feel like there was actual interruption happening in the discussion. I don't know. You guys let me know what you thought of that one. Hopefully everybody enjoyed it. Beyond the CGT Olympics episode, I have been very hard at work at trying to literally get all of year three's content pretty much sewn up. So what I mean by that is, as I think most of you know, I go through a process where I lay out a roadmap and then I basically have a multi-step kind of thing. And we're actually going to have a Patreon episode in the near future that talks all about my process for creating these podcast episodes. So I'm not going to go into super detail here, but what I've done is I've laid out all of year three. For the most part, there could be some variability there as either sponsored content comes up or we want to shift things around a little bit. But I know every single episode that I'm going to be covering for year three. That is literally at this point around 50 episodes. I have that all planned out. I have also played nearly every single game that we're going to be covering for episodes all the way up through episode 150. I have scripted my reviews for all but 5 of those games, which means I have been working ridiculously to both play the games, review the games, get all that content out there while still maintaining a fairly significant backlog of recorded episodes as well as scripted full episodes that I just have to sit down and record. There is like a whole pipeline of content here, which I got to say, when I first started making this podcast, I mean, I had a similar kind of thought process when I did my other podcasts, but certainly not nearly as detailed, not nearly as structured as what I do here, because this is a weekly release and we have our Patreon episodes on top of that. So to keep everything in order, I've had to put myself into this structured mode where I always have something going on. Basically, anything I'm doing right now is pretty much going to become content at some point. It's funny because I know Dave, I am the Dizzle out on Discord. He had said before, or he mentioned before, I think it might have been on one of his other podcasts, that he basically said everything is content. And you know what? That's kind of true. Every game I play almost is I'm kind of thinking, well, is that something I can do for CGT? Or is that something I could do for expansion pack? Like if it's a modern thing, maybe that'll become a future expansion pack episode. Or is that going to inform a future episode in some way where it becomes part of a list or ranking episode or maybe a new challenge? Like everything I do, most of what I'm doing now in my spare time has something to do with the podcast. And it's a ton of fun. But as I mentioned, I think I mentioned this maybe an episode or two before. Well, definitely not during the Olympics episode, but maybe the episode before that. I had mentioned that I was thinking of something new, something else I was going to start working on related to podcasting, but not necessarily 100% tied into the CGT formula, CGT format kind of thing. One of the reasons that I've been pushing myself to get year 3 content pretty much nailed down and made it so that each week I have a little bit more limited amount of work to do on those individual episodes is because I want to really explore this new idea that I have in my head. I'm not ready to share that idea yet. If it comes to fruition, you will all know all about it because I'm thinking, I'm kind of working through my process as a real-time, sort of like a dev blog kind of thing, but it's not a dev blog. It's actually a making of series for what I'm about to be embarking on. So this is what's going to happen. If I actually kick off this new idea, if this new idea actually becomes a reality, by the time it goes live, there will be a full set of episodes detailing the making of that thing, the entire making of that thing. I have no idea how many episodes that's going to be because I am recording myself. I'm recording the whole process of conceptualization to the actual work that's going into it, to my thought process, everything. It's going to be a true behind the scenes making of kind of thing, which may not be interesting to everybody, but I know I do get some questions every now and then about, well, just the general act of podcasting or what goes into an episode or how you do this or how you do that. I am trying to actually document everything that I'm doing with this new idea in pseudo podcast form. So if my new idea becomes reality, I will be releasing the entire making of series for that new idea, which, hey, might be interesting. Or even if my new idea doesn't come to reality, maybe I'll release the thing anyway, along with a postmortem. I don't know. Lots of ideas in my head, but anyway, that is why I have been focusing so hard on trying to get year 3 content nailed down, because I want to make it so that I give myself enough breathing room to work on this new idea, see if there are any legs behind it that I could actually do something with, and we'll see what happens. I'll keep you all in the loop once I'm ready to know, or once I know more and once I'm ready to communicate more, but just wanted to give you a little bit of insight. That's kind of something I've been working on. So other than that, just like I said, grinding out the content, grinding out the different games, certainly working on any additional sponsored content that comes in. It's kind of my world. It's kind of what I've been doing now recently. It's now approaching the fall season, so things will change a little bit in terms of nothing's going to change visibly from a podcast perspective, but as far as personal life, because with fall comes much more routine between school and not going outside in the backyard as much and all that kind of stuff. So it's just a little shift from a life perspective as the colder weather starts to settle in. It's certainly not cold right now. I think it's going to be 90 degrees today, at least where I live. So it's not cold yet, but I can see it on the horizon. As they said in a popular television series, winter is coming, and I want to be prepared for that. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day, and that is Disco Elysium. But before we get to that, like I mentioned earlier, ISO is the sponsor for this episode. He did send in a message for me to read for all of us to listen to. So this message is from ISO. If you're hearing the smooth and sexy voice of Tony right now, that means I've chickened out of recording my own audio. Disco Elysium is a very important game to me for 2 reasons. 1, this was my before dad game. If you're unfamiliar with this term, it's likely because I've just made it up, but a lot of you might recognize the concept. This was my last big game I completed before my path of fatherhood began. I knew I'd still find time to play games after the birth of my daughter, but I was also not naive enough to think I'd be able to devote away hours of free time. I played and loved this game at 5 a.m. by myself, drinking liters of tea, and now looking back, its memory is interwoven with my excitement for the birth of my daughter, Jasmine. The second reason this game is so high on my personal pantheon is that I am an alcoholic. Well, more accurately, recovering alcoholic. When this game was first released, I played it while I was still drinking and I physically had to stop. It held a mirror so bright and scary to my face. For those unfamiliar, the game follows a protagonist who is struggling deeply with alcohol and is currently dealing with the world's worst hangover. I could relate all too well to the scenes of forgotten drunken misadventures and dark voices poisoning my own reason. But thankfully, to bring this to a happier tone, my beautiful family helped me find sobriety. By the time you're hearing this, I will be a few days short of 4 years sober. I returned to Disco Elysium nearly a year after I stopped drinking. While it was still confronting, what was once scary had become empowering. Needless to say, I played as a sober cop for my playthrough. Never has a game made my personal input feel so impactful, and every decision felt meaningful. Each moment of this game is so beautiful and unlike anything I've played before or since. Much like life, it's sad, funny, hopeful, and hopeless, often all at the same time. I hope anyone listening and discovering this game will get as much out of it as I did. And for anyone struggling with addiction or with mental health, please reach out to me or anyone you feel comfortable with. Talking is the first step to healing. Our Discord has done more good than you'll ever know, Tony. Love, ISO. Thank you, ISO, for your heartfelt message. Congratulations on your sobriety. And as always, thank you for your sponsorship and support. Disco Elysium is a role-playing game developed and published by Zaum and released for most modern computer and console platforms back in 2019, with the revised Final Cut edition with expanded content releasing in 2021. Before we can talk about Disco Elysium, we need to dive a bit further back into the state of Eastern Europe in the late 90s and early 2000s, and in particular, we need to take a look at Estonia, a country that had previously been part of the Soviet Union and had to deal with multiple unwanted Soviet occupations over the years before finally regaining its independence as a sovereign nation in 1991. As Estonia began working through how to govern itself, now that it didn't have to operate as a member of the Soviet Union, a number of different political and ideological beliefs and movements began to surface, some of which leaned towards then traditional communist concepts, while others were decidedly anti-communist, a reflection of the country's desire to distance itself from the Soviet ideals that it had to align with for most of its history. Throughout the 90s, the country would continue to experience a degree of uncertainty and unrest, as Estonia's government had to deal with conflicting beliefs amongst its own membership while also attempting to do what it perceived was best for a divided population that, at the time, didn't have any degree of financial or political stability. This manifested itself in a number of ways, from the technology available in the country to common pastimes and hobbies of its inhabitants, to the quality of education for school-age children, to the art, literature, and cultural styles that permeated the population. Despite having gained its independence in the early 90s, by the time the clock struck midnight in the year 2000, the country was still trying to figure things out, though it had begun to make moves to improve the political and financial stability of the nation, and by extension, its inhabitants. I don't believe anyone at the time would have considered Estonia to be affluent by any means, but change was on the horizon, a sign that, hopefully, fortunes would begin to turn around. That being said, for individuals who grew up in Estonia in the 80s and 90s, during both the collapse of the Soviet Union and the period of time following that upheaval, life was not about financial affluence and political stability. Life was about political unrest and economic uncertainty, and it was this environment that several individuals in our story found themselves in at the turn of the millennium, specifically Robert Kurvitz, Alexander Rostov, Kara Kender, and Helen Hindpeer. Robert Kurvitz was born in 1984, and from a very early age became impacted by all of the unrest and uncertainty that was Estonia in the 80s and 90s. Despite the difficulties faced by everyone around this time, Kurvitz's parents envisioned a future where their son could hopefully get a good education and eventually a successful career, though the environment of the time had taken its toll on Kurvitz, so much so that by the time he was 15, he became completely disillusioned with formal education, and in 1999 decided to drop out of school, much to the chagrin of his parents. After dropping out of school, Kurvitz began exploring various cultural and political movements of the time, and in the process began hanging out with a group of other like-minded, somewhat radical individuals, all of whom wanted, in some way, to change the world. Though that change, in Kurvitz's own words, was not something the group wanted to experience slowly. Instead, that group, whose nickname was the Overcoats, was comprised of, in their own words, anarchists, people who wanted to spearhead direct and transformative change to hopefully address what they perceived as the issues that were still plaguing Estonia. That being said, it's not entirely clear just how impactful this group would end up being, as from what I could tell, there wasn't much in the way of actual action coming out of this pseudo-organization. Instead, its members would simply hang out with each other and, in an attempt to escape from the realities of their daily lives, would play pen and paper role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons extensively. Only here, the group of like-minded individuals, and eventually friends, would go far beyond simply playing Dungeons & Dragons. They also were incredibly creative, and in particular, began to create their own campaigns for the tabletop RPG, envisioning steampunk fantasy worlds where the harsh realities of the real world would mesh with the fantasy stylings of a dystopian steampunk setting, a far cry from the traditional medieval campaigns that most D&D players both created and played. It was around this time and during these pen and paper game sessions that Robert Kurvitz would meet the Estonian novelist Kara Kender, the oil painting artist Alexander Rostov, and the incredibly talented storyteller Helen Hindpeer. These four creative and talented individuals struck up a fairly close friendship and would all be instrumental in the creation of the Zaum Cultural Association, which was effectively the evolution of the Overcoats, albeit focused less on anarchy and more on art, music, and creative expression. It was as part of this group, and in response to financial challenges felt by all of its members in 2005, that the quartet would begin brainstorming ways of turning their creative passions into money-making ventures, though at the time, prospects for actually doing something lucrative were pretty limited. That didn't stop the group of four creatives from bouncing ideas off of each other, and in particular, they began to expand upon some of the D&D steampunk campaigns they had previously created, and enjoyed, eventually deciding on the creation of a full-fledged standalone tabletop RPG, heavily inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, but unique in its rule set, settings, and general stylistic elements. This tabletop RPG would be set in the fantasy world of Elysium, a sort of fictionalized, slightly more fantastical version of the Estonian real world that Kurvitz, Kender, Rostov, and Hindpeer had been experiencing in their day-to-day lives, complete with various political ideologies and beliefs, and a focus on conversation-based encounters rather than combat-driven battles. Interestingly, beyond the Estonian environment the team was living in, and the Dungeons & Dragons campaigns they had previously enjoyed, one of the other major inspirations for the style of RPG they were trying to create was, in fact, the venerable computer role-playing game, and in particular, the Infinity Engine classic Planescape Torment, which featured an amnesiac character who would explore an expansive, lore-centric world where conversation and charisma, rather than combat and critical hits, were the main way to progress through the game. And in fact, the Estonian game-playing population of the time was actually really heavy into computer role-playing games, much more so than their console-based cousins like the Final Fantasies and Chrono Crosses of the world. Now, you might be wondering why Estonia was primarily a CRPG community as opposed to console gamers, and the reason for that had to do with the economics of the time. Like we were talking about, the majority of Estonians were not financially stable around this time, and the thought of purchasing a video game console like the Sony PlayStation was an impossibility for many individuals living in the financially depressed nation. Computers, however, were a bit more readily available. Not because Estonian families could afford those devices, but because workplaces would often provide their employees with computers as part of their job, ostensibly to allow those individuals to actually perform their job responsibilities. Well, it didn't take long before individuals realized that they could install other software on those machines, like games, and because those machines weren't typically the most powerful systems, games with heavy graphics requirements like 3D accelerated titles simply wouldn't run. So, if someone wanted to install a game on their work-provided computer and actually have it be runnable with any degree of performance, they were effectively forced to focus on gaming genres that had lower system requirements in general, which, given other shifts in the computer industry around this time, meant that computer role-playing games became the de facto flavor of the day for the majority of Estonian computer gamers, including the Zaum Cultural Association. As the quartet of Kurvits, Kender, Rostov, and Hinpir continued to develop the concepts around their Elysium setting and the correlated tabletop RPG, Kender and Kurvits began to brainstorm how to take those concepts and turn it into something that could potentially make some money. And, given Kender's background as a novelist and Kurvits' own latent abilities, the duo decided to work on writing a novel, using the tabletop setting of Elysium as the world for the book, and conceptualizing a story focusing on three men who were attempting to solve a mystery surrounding the disappearance of their classmates from 20 years prior. Over the course of 5 years, Kurvits worked on the novel, with Kender providing mentorship and general advice, until finally, in 2013, Kurvits would self-publish Sacred and Terrible Air, introducing the world to Zaum's Elysium setting for the first time. Critical response for the book was fairly positive, with a number of individuals praising Kurvits for both his writing style as well as the way he was able to marry what critics called proper literature with steampunk and science fiction stylings, and for a period of time, it seemed like Kurvits was going to have a hit on his hands. Unfortunately, actual sales of the novel were incredibly low, and overall the book would only sell a little over 1,000 copies shortly after its release, not nearly enough to change the financial prospects of its author, nor enough to bridge the Elysium setting into other creative efforts that could leverage the talents of Kurvits' broader friend group, like Alexander Rostov and Helid Hinpir. The lack of sales for Kurvits' book hit him really hard, and would end up driving him to become an alcoholic, a period of time when all of his creative pursuits were put on hold in favor of finding comfort in alcohol-fueled escapism. Coincidentally, Kurvits' friend and book collaborator Kara Kender was also experiencing his own challenges with alcoholism around this time, and the two men were quickly spiraling into an abyss that could have potentially thwarted any and all potential for future success. Certainly a difficult time for the two friends, and even broader, a significant impact to the Zaum Cultural Association and the various friends the duo had made over the last 10 years. Luckily, after 3 years, Robert Kurvits was able to pull himself out of the throes of alcohol addiction, and in the process was also able to help his friend, Kara Kender, overcome his alcoholism as well. With the two friends finally returning to a more normal existence, they rejoined their longtime Zaum compatriots, and shortly after reforming their core quartet, they began to think about how to once again use their collective talents and creativity to hopefully make some money. And here, there were several options on the table, none of which were particularly attractive to the group. They could potentially write another novel, though the sting of Sacred and Terrible Air's failure still hung in the air, and considering how much that failure impacted Kurvits, that didn't feel like the right move to make. They could also potentially have focused on some other creative endeavor, like music, which Kurvits had previously pursued while performing in a band at the turn of the millennium, or art, which was Alexander Rostov's specialty. But none of these options really felt like something that would leverage all of the team's collective skill sets. The question was, how could they truly combine their talents into an integrated, collaborative team effort? One day in 2016, a chance discussion between Kender and his children would dramatically change the trajectory of the quartet's fortunes. Kender had been talking about continuing to write novels, which he had been doing for over 20 years at this point, when his children turned to him and, in a way that only your children can do, basically told him to stop being so old. They effectively said to him that writing novels was a waste of time because, and I quote, "nobody reads books." Instead, his kids encouraged him to do something completely outside of his comfort zone. They suggested that, rather than publishing another novel, he should, instead, make a video game. Kender considered the idea and surprisingly thought it had some merit. Now, that's not to say that he had the foggiest idea of how to create a game, but regardless, it seemed like something that could potentially be a worthwhile project to pursue. And considering some of the creative individuals in his friend circle, he began to think that maybe, just maybe, making a video game would appeal to them as well, and as a result, give them all something to work on collectively. Taking a step back, when you think about the creation of a video game, it's not hard to see why it would be the perfect project for a team with various creative talents. Because, as we've talked about multiple times before, making a video game requires the integration of art, music, technical prowess, storytelling, and general design, just to name a few focus areas that go into a successful video game. For a team with varied creative talents, making a game provides an opportunity for everyone to contribute in some capacity, which is exactly what Kender and his group of friends were interested in pursuing. So, Kender came to Robert Kurvitz and suggested that perhaps they could work on a game, and his immediate response was something akin to, "What the heck are you even talking about?" Kurvitz, like Kender, had no idea how to make a game, and even though the prospect of working on something with his group of friends sounded fun, he really wasn't convinced this was something that would end with any sort of positive outcome. In fact, he assumed that they would fail at making a video game, the same way he had failed at writing a successful novel, which from his perspective meant that they should scrap the idea entirely. Longtime friend Alexander Rostov, however, had a totally different take on the matter. He suggested that the group had previously failed at making a marketable tabletop RPG, and Kurvitz had previously failed at writing a popular novel. So, what's the harm in trying to make a game? Worst case scenario, they fail at that too, but at least they could potentially have some fun working together. With low expectations and even less understanding of how they were going to even start working together to create a game, Kurvitz, Kender, Rostov, and Helen Hinpier began to brainstorm different ideas for their forthcoming endeavor. And here, their prior work actually ended up paying off. Like we've talked about, the group had a fair amount of amateur experience in creating both tabletop RPG campaigns and expanding that experience to create a full RPG tabletop framework itself. And they fleshed out the setting of their tabletop RPG fairly extensively through Kurvitz's failed novel. The team considered, what if they used the Elysium setting as the basis for their potential game? And what if they used the tabletop RPG mechanics they had previously designed and converted them into a digital computer role-playing game format? The team figured that this was something that they might in fact be able to do. So, with that goal in mind, the company's Alm, not to be confused with the cultural association that the team had previously belonged to, was formed in 2016, with Kurvitz, Kender, Rostov, and Hinpier all being founding members. As the team began functioning under the new company structure, it quickly became apparent that making a game, even one with a fairly limited scope, which was their intention, would take a fair amount of working capital. And the fact is, none of the team really had a ton of liquid assets to use to fund the game's development. Kender, however, stepped up and, in a move that showed his commitment to the team's potential, sold his car, using the proceeds from that sale to begin funding development for the title, which at the time was codenamed No Truce with the Furies. Kurvitz and the rest of the team, meanwhile, began to design the game, which, as you might expect, was influenced heavily by both the life experiences of the team, as well as the games and technologies they had fondness for. What that meant is that the game would be a gritty, Estonian-inspired landscape, with a painterly style shown from an isometric perspective, similar to the team's favorite CRPG, Planescape Torment, and would include a ton of dialogue rather than combat in order to progress the game's story. As the design continued to be refined, Zaum as a company began to attract the interest of several investors, and given some of the concepts and early design work completed for their game, the team acquired enough funding to begin building out a full team of both contractors and full-time staff, all of whom were dedicated to bringing this conceptual video game to market. Over time, ownership of the company would be split amongst several different investors, including Estonian businessman Margus Linnamäe, who would end up funding the majority of the game's development. And as the level of funding increased, so too did the scope of the game, which had ballooned from being focused on a single location to now encompassing the majority of a city, complete with an open-world style design and an ever-expanding set of dialogues and choices that players could make that could potentially alter the course of the game in any number of ways, both minor and dramatic. The insertion of player choice into the title came about directly because of Kurvitz's desire to create a deep role-playing experience, similar to what he had enjoyed while playing tabletop RPGs in the past, albeit tempered by the reality that predefined computer programming couldn't possibly take every single potential player choice into account. Instead, Kurvitz and the team focused on what they called micro-reactivity, where seemingly small events or dialogue choices would end up potentially having a downstream impact on the game. Not every player choice would lead to dramatic impacts, but Kurvitz felt that even the smaller scale impacts would make the game feel more alive, and would in turn create a greater sense that players truly were playing a game that reacted fully to their choices. Building out the content for the game world would fall to a team of 8 different writers, all of whom took their prior experiences living in Estonia and other less affluent areas to inject the game with a dose of fictionalized reality, inclusive of political ideologies, racial tensions, and economic conflicts. And the team didn't want to shy away from tackling some very mature and potentially disturbing subject matter. The team also had a bit of a sense of humor, and they decided to include a ton of additional content in the game, even narratives and storylines that didn't contribute to the game's main story arc, simply because they figured, why not? When you play the game and encounter the story of a failed game development studio who attempted to change the world, potentially unsuccessfully, well, that was the team writing about the fear they all felt when creating their game, because they had no guarantee that their efforts would ever result in a completed releasable title. And the ridiculous number of books included in the game, most of which have no bearing on the game's outcome, those were included because the team occasionally needed to relax from writing the main narrative, and they ended up writing several short stories as a way of de-stressing. These short stories, rather than being discarded, were included in the game, the thought being that additional content, especially if it was well written, was always a good thing. And additional content, it turns out, was something that the team at Zaum continued to generate, so much so that the game increased in size dramatically over the course of its development. What was once going to be a fairly short, compact title released in 2017 would over time expand to encompass multiple locations, which necessitated several delays to the final release date of the game. It would also interestingly necessitate a change to the working title for the game. And here, the team wanted to select something that would have multiple meanings, but would also represent the major goal of the game, which was to learn, both about yourself, as players would begin the game suffering from amnesia, as well as about your surroundings, which given your amnesiac status, would feel like exploring a totally foreign land. Taking that focus into account, as well as the more explicit visual and narrative style the team was including in the game, the decision was made to rename the title as Disco Elysium, both a reference to the game's protagonist and his style, as well as the fact that in Latin, the word disco literally means to learn. With a new name in place, a development team of over 55 individuals, and a significant amount of anticipation, Kurvitz, Kender, Rostov, Hindpeer, and the rest of Zaum would end up releasing Disco Elysium on the market in late 2019, after years of development bolstered by even more years of conceptualization and tangentially related side projects. The team had succeeded in bringing their creative talents together to make and release a brand new game, something that nobody had ever thought was possible years before. The only question was, would this new game be yet another failure on the resumes of all involved, or would Disco Elysium represent a successful joint venture? Well, it didn't take long before the answer to that question was discovered, as shortly after Disco Elysium was released, it would achieve universal critical acclaim, with many publications declaring Disco Elysium to be the best game of the year, and even more broadly, one of the best CRPGs ever created. The overall writing, narrative, thematic elements, and art style earned special recognition, and by the time the end-of-year Game Awards season got rolling, Disco Elysium and the core creative team at Zaum would end up winning a significant number of industry accolades, including multiple perfect scores, numerous Game of the Year awards, and various other recognitions that proved that Disco Elysium, and the team behind it, was truly something special. Disco Elysium's success was so profound, in fact, that shortly after its release, a number of future projects in the Elysium universe were announced, including an expansion, a full-fledged sequel, a tabletop RPG, a television show, and a clothing line, just to name a few of the opportunities on the table as a result of Disco Elysium's success. The future was seemingly very bright for Disco Elysium and Zaum as a company, and as a means of continuing to expand the game's overall player base while also giving something new to its current fans, the team would release Disco Elysium: The Final Cut in 2021, which was provided as a free update to prior owners on computer platforms and would represent the first time the game would appear on a home console rather than a computer monitor. This update would also, perhaps most impressively, include fully voice-acted dialogue for every single character and thought in the game, an effort that took over 14 months and would involve actors from around the globe adding their voice talents to the game. After the Final Cut came out, Disco Elysium's popularity was at an all-time high, and it certainly seemed like Zaum was going to enter the rarefied air of other major industry CRPG designers, like BioWare, Black Isle, and Larian Studios. Nobody knew what the future would hold, but one thing was for certain. Disco Elysium was undoubtedly going to be the title, and the underlying setting that would propel Zaum to superstardom. This, however, would end up not being the case, and the fact is that at this point, our story takes a truly tragic turn. Recall our discussion from earlier related to Zaum seeking out funding from various investors in order to acquire the working capital needed to make Disco Elysium a reality. As you might expect, Zaum did in fact attract several different investors that would invest fairly heavily in the company. One of those individuals, like we mentioned, was Margus Liname, an individual with a fairly significant level of investment in both Disco Elysium and Zaum overall, though nothing that would give him absolute control over the company. Because, as part of Zaum's founding, guidelines were put in place to limit overall ownership of the company to under 50% for any individual investor, a decision made to prevent a single person from being able to effectively take over the entire company. Sure, Zaum had a leadership structure in place along with the CEO, Ilmar Campos, who had authority over the direction of the company, but as far as actual shareholder ownership, that was distributed amongst several different investors. After Disco Elysium had released, and as work was getting underway for Disco Elysium 2, Zaum's CEO, Ilmar Campos, wanted to purchase the company outright through the use of a separate company that he owned, effectively executing a hostile, and some would claim fraudulent, corporate takeover. The details of this whole chain of events is admittedly convoluted, but according to several individuals, including the core team of Kurvitz, Kender, Rostov, and Hindpir, Campos had purchased a set of 4 concept art sketches from Zaum for €1, and then sold those sketches back to Zaum for €4.8 million, effectively giving him enough money to acquire the studio for free, and through some loopholes in the shareholder structure, giving him over 70% control over the company. When he was questioned about this seemingly offensive move by members of Zaum's creative team, they were all fired from the company, with Kurvitz in particular being painted as someone who created a hostile, threatening work environment, and therefore wasn't fit to remain with the company. While Kurvitz and his crew pursued legal action against both Campos and his brother-in-law, who had previously been convicted for fraud and was accused of being an accomplice in the takeover, the end result of this whole mess is that the people most responsible for the creation of the world of Elysium, and by extension Disco Elysium itself, were all fired from the company and lost any claims to their intellectual property, meaning the work that they created over a period of almost 2 decades. Despite the fact that Disco Elysium would never have existed without the collective work of Kurvitz and his team, they no longer were associated with that work, and for all intents and purposes, their baby was stolen from them, right from under their noses. Now obviously, I wasn't there, and as always, there are 2 sides to every story. But I will say that it certainly seems like Kurvitz, Kender, Rostov, and Hindpir were ousted as a result of unethical and unscrupulous business conduct, as opposed to a true workplace issue on their parts. In fact, anyone who questioned what was happening at the leadership level during this time was outright fired, which suggests to me that things were happening that certain people in leadership didn't want others to question or know about. Regardless of what did or did not happen, the end result is the same, which is any chance of future Disco Elysium projects, including those previously greenlit, are seemingly dead in the water. And even if Zaum as a company were to be dissolved in the future, most likely the Disco Elysium intellectual property would be sold off to some other faceless corporate entity rather than be returned to the people most responsible for the game's creation. A sad outcome all around, and one that illustrates very clearly the disparity between creative endeavors and corporate capitalistic greed. Ironically, some of these same themes are prevalent in the game itself, a strange and unexpected example of art imitating life, almost prophetically. While the future is uncertain, and it's unclear what either Zaum or the ousted team of Kurvitz, Kender, Rostov, and Hindpeer will do in the future, the fact is that Disco Elysium, independent of all of the negative and hostile circumstances surrounding it from the last couple years, stands as a shining light in the CRPG space, and certainly one of the better computer role-playing titles that has ever been created. My hope is that the creative team that brought Disco Elysium to life will have additional opportunities to share their talents with all of us in the future. But even if that never happens, Disco Elysium remains a landmark achievement in writing, storytelling, and more broadly, gaming in general, and as such is undoubtedly a title that will continue to be remembered and loved for countless years to come. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Disco Elysium today versus when it was released. Well, wait a second. It was a modern game. What am I talking about? We're just going to talk about what it feels like to play Disco Elysium. So at its core, Disco Elysium is a role-playing game, and more specifically, is styled similarly to Infinity Engine computer role-playing games made popular by BioWare and Black Isle Studios in the late 90s, like the Baldur's Gate series and Planescape Torment. And just like those CRPGs of yesteryear, Disco Elysium contains all of the features you'd expect in a traditional deep role-playing game, with a number of different stats to augment, skills to unlock, equipment to discover, quests to complete, and choices to be made that will ultimately have an impact on how the story for your personal playthrough will progress. Now, hearing that description, you might assume Disco Elysium is just like any other CRPG that you may have played in the past, but the fact is, Disco Elysium is actually different from most, if not all, CRPGs that I personally have ever experienced. It is so unique, in fact, that simply calling it a CRPG is a bit of a mischaracterization, because all of the expectations that you likely have when you hear the term CRPG are, in Disco Elysium's case, oftentimes subverted and usually exceeded. To put it bluntly, Disco Elysium is a game that, to a large degree, defies a simple characterization. To understand why that is, we need to talk about the overall structure for Disco Elysium, along with how it takes standard CRPG mechanics and turns them on their head. And to do that, we'll go through what it feels like to actually start up a playthrough of Disco Elysium, and some of the mechanics you'll encounter as you begin to play the game, which interestingly, is a pretty good indicator of what you'll experience throughout your entire playthrough. As with most RPGs, the first thing you'll need to do when you begin playing the game is make your character. And here, you'll see the first indications that Disco Elysium is unlike most other CRPGs you may have played. Unlike most RPGs that use fairly traditional stats like strength, intelligence, agility, and charisma, in Disco Elysium, you'll be spreading a handful of points across such skill categories as intellect, psyche, physique, and motorics, each of which have 6 underlying subskills that, at least at the start of the game, inherit the skill level of the category that applies to a given subskill. As an example, let's take a look at the physique skill category, which, as you might imagine, governs your overall physical prowess within the context of the game. Under Physique, you have 6 different subskills that you can eventually assign skill points to, those being Endurance, Pain Threshold, Physical Instrument, electrochemistry, shivers, and half-light, and whatever number of skill points, up to a maximum of 5, you put into the physique skill category will be applied to each of those subskills. So, assuming you max out your physique, each of the subskills associated with the physique category will be all set to 5 at the start of the game. As you play, you'll earn experience which will allow you to collect additional skill points, each of which can be assigned to any subskill in the game, though the total number of skill points you can assign to any given subskill is limited by the overall skill level of the overarching category that those subskills are associated with. Returning to our physique example, if you max it out at 5, then that means that not only will your starting value for each physique subskill be 5, but you'll also be able to allocate up to 5 earned skill points to each of those subskills, meaning each subskill within the physique category can be augmented to a level of 10, assuming no other modifiers are applied to a given skill. If you'd only put 2 points into physique, then each subskill will have started at 2, and you would only be able to allocate 2 additional skill points to each subskill, eventually reaching a max of 4 for each of those subskills. Make sense? It might sound a bit complicated to talk about, but in-game, it's actually pretty straightforward to understand. What is less straightforward, though, are the individual subskills associated with each of the 4 skill categories, because the majority of them are described in such a way that they drive more questions than answers, at least before you get used to how those subskills work within the context of the game. Sticking with our physique example, I mentioned that there are 6 subskills under that category: endurance, pain threshold, physical instrument, electrochemistry, shivers, and half-light. Some of those, like endurance, are pretty easy to understand, as more points in endurance simply increases your overall max hit points. Other skills, however, are harder to understand. Take, for example, shivers, whose description reads, "Raise the hair on your neck. Tune in to the city." Cool for city lovers, the wisest of the streetwise, the genuinely supranatural. Shivers come when the temperature drops and you become more keenly aware of your surroundings. It enables you to hear the city itself, to truly belong to the streets. It is a supranatural ability. Old wrongs play out in present time, scenes across the city happen in front of you. But who is speaking to you? At high levels, shivers may make you seem mad to the outside world. As you listen to the city, you don't listen to others. Your superiors may begin to worry. With the low shivers, though, you will seldom hear the city speaking to you. And if you cannot hear it, how can you ever save it? When I first read that description, I figured, okay, this lets me learn more about my surroundings, similar to how an outdoorsman skill might impact your ability to detect hidden caches of items in a traditional fantasy RPG. But honestly, I wasn't 100% sure. Then we come to a subskill like electrochemistry, which reads, "Go to party planet, love and be loved by drugs." Cool for high flyers, party enthusiasts, cops who need lightning. Electrochemistry is the animal within you, the beast longing to be unleashed to indulge and enjoy. It enables you to take drugs with fewer negative side effects. It also enables you to better investigate lurid matters. If you need to understand a chemical breakdown or talk to someone blasted out of their mind or understand sexual dynamics, electrochemistry is there to guide you. At high levels, electrochemistry makes you a man of unrestrained pleasure. An unrepentant Lothario who leers at people with a bottle of speed and a plastic bendy straw in the either hand. But with a low electrochemistry, you'll be too innocent to be effective. Without a working knowledge of drugs and sex, the city will be difficult to understand. Reading that one, I'm assuming that that's a subskill that rewards you for taking drugs and imbibing alcohol, while also giving you insight into the seedier aspects of the game world. But here, also, I wasn't really sure how that would play out in-game, as it wasn't clear to me if this was something that was purely for flavor, or something that would actually impact my playthrough to a greater extent. Those same questions were raised for almost every skill I examined, and my first thought upon finalizing my character build and entering the game was, I have absolutely no clue what I'm doing. More so than almost any other RPG I've played, I felt a smidge overwhelmed at the start, simply because I didn't know if my personal build, which was focused more on intellect and speech, would even be viable in the game. I was legitimately going into this blind, and I honestly didn't know what to expect. Now, before we continue, I need to give you a personal recommendation. Despite the feeling of not knowing what the heck you're doing, please go into the game blind if you've never played it before. What I came to realize is that Every single skill is worthwhile in its own right, and I don't think there's a single build in the game that is truly non-viable. You'll learn and develop your own style for your character as you play the game, so don't let the initial character creation and feeling of uncertainty overwhelm you. Just go with the flow. Anyway, once you create your character, you'll be dropped into the game to begin playing, and here you'll notice that the user interface is fairly similar to many other RPGs that you may have played in the past. In the bottom left corner of the screen, you'll see your character portrait along with your current health and morale meter, both of which serve as a form of hit points that, if depleted, will cause you to lose the game. Losing all of your health is fairly self-explanatory, as it is directly analogous to nearly every other game with a health system. The difference here is, you're not going to be taking physical damage from combat, at least in most cases, because Disco Elysium is a game without any true RPG combat system. There are no enemies to fight with a variety of weaponry, no camps of bad guys to defeat, no spawns of evil creatures to farm. In Disco Elysium, every form of combat, so to speak, comes from the words you use, or the environmental interactions you undertake. We'll talk more about this in a little bit, but for now, just recognize that physical damage is typically associated with failing to do something correctly in the environment that involves physical exertion, such as kicking a non-functioning machine awkwardly and hurting your foot. And yes, that did happen to me. Morale is a different matter entirely, and involves your overall mental state of mind as you interact with the world, learn more about your past behaviors and identity, and have conversations with non-player characters throughout your playthrough. Get slammed by a particularly nasty insult? That'll probably drop your morale meter. Realize that you acted like a complete insane person during a week-long alcohol-infused bender? Yeah, that's probably not good for morale either. By contrast, though, you can also potentially replenish your morale meter by performing certain tasks well as you play the game. Figure out a hidden clue at a crime scene? Well, that feels pretty good, so your morale meter might actually partially replenish. Get a nice compliment from your partner? Woohoo, that makes you happy, and therefore replenishes a point on your morale meter. This whole system of dual hit points is pretty interesting, and while I don't think I ever allowed myself to lose all of my morale points, I did end up losing all of my health a couple times, which, as you might expect, results in death and a game over. Losing all of your morale points also results in a game over, but instead of dying, you simply lose the will to continue, which, depending on the situation you're facing, might manifest itself in one of several different game over screens. The good news is that you'll find various health and morale replenishment items as you play the game, so you should be able to keep yourself topped up fairly well, and I don't think I ever experienced any event that dropped my health or morale by more than a single point at a time. There are a couple situations that will cause continued depletion of one resource or the other, depending on how you respond to the situation you're facing, but even then, you'll have an opportunity to pop a health or morale replenishing item before you outright lose the game. Generally speaking, I didn't have any issue keeping myself alive, assuming I didn't pick a total bonehead response to a very obviously bad situation that, through my actions, I only made worse. Anyway, continuing on through the interface, there's also a button where you can view your current build, skills, and subskills, which is also where you'd assign additional skill points, assuming you've acquired any. Experience in the game doesn't contribute to the concept of levels, meaning there is no level up system in the game. What experience does allow you to do is acquire additional skill points, and every time you make 100 experience points, you'll get a new skill point. This might sound super quaint in comparison to other games where you typically level up, with each successful level requiring an ever-increasing amount of experience to get to the next level. Not so with Disco Elysium, as you'll only ever have to earn 100 experience in order to get a new skill point. Now, that being said, the amount of experience you get for completing quests and uncovering interesting responses to dialogue options is fairly limited, and if I recall correctly, the most experience I ever got at a single point in time was 70 experience points, or 70% of a skill point. So even though the total experience you need to gather skill points is relatively low, the game is balanced around that concept, which does take some getting used to if you're more familiar with massive epic fantasy RPGs where it's not uncommon to gather hundreds of thousands of experience points before being able to level up. Interestingly, any skill points you acquire serve two distinct purposes. One, which is fairly obvious, is to augment your existing subskills, making your character more proficient at whatever subskill you've decided to increase. The other purpose, which corresponds to an incredibly interesting and unique aspect of the game, is to unlock slots in your thought cabinet, which is Disco Elysium's version of a tailorable skill tree. You know how in many RPGs you may have a bunch of different skill modifiers that are separate from your core stats like strength or intelligence that allow you to more directly tailor your character's build? Things like two-handed melee mastery, where if you select that skill you may become more proficient with two-handed weaponry, but it gives you no benefit to any other skill or combat trait. Well, in Disco Elysium, the Thought Cabinet provides a similar kind of mechanic. Only here, as with most other aspects of the game, Disco Elysium does things just a bit differently. Instead of being presented with a tree of different skill modifiers to unlock, your Thought Cabinet consists of a number of different thoughts and topics, all of which have to be unlocked through playing the game before you even have the opportunity to explore that topic or thought. As a hypothetical example, let's say one of the thoughts in your Thought Cabinet is something called Super Cop, and based on reading the brief description, it sounds like something you'd be interested in. Well, you need to find the specific dialogue sequence or in-world action to unlock that thought as something you can research before you can actually do anything with it. For the sake of discussion, let's say you eventually find the right dialogue choices with the right person that unlocks the Super Cop thought. If you do that, then Super Cop becomes a thought you can assign to an open slot in your Thought Cabinet, which then kicks off a period of time where you effectively research or think about that thought, which may bring with it some sort of short-term penalty, presumably because you're concentrating so hard on that thought that it's to the detriment of your other skills. In our hypothetical example, let's say that because you're focusing on the Super Cop thought so intently, it makes your other thought processes less sharp, so you take a short-term hit to the Encyclopedia subskill, which contributes to your overall understanding of trivia and facts in the game world. This short-term impact may affect different interactions that you have while you're focusing on your Super Cop thought, which means there may be a period of time where trying to become more proficient at something may open you up to negative ramifications. Eventually, though, you'll complete your thought process and Super Cop will become a fully realized thought, with the short-term impact to Encyclopedia removed to be replaced with a permanent set of buffs, and potentially debuffs, depending on the thought you completed. This system of thinking about a thought and then having it impact your overall build is incredibly interesting, as is the fact that you need to act a certain way and speak with certain people or interact with certain objects before you even have the chance to research a given thought and further customize your character build. The only aspect of this system that I thought could be potentially frustrating is the fact that you have no way of knowing what the final set of buffs and negatives are going to be before you complete your thought research, which means you might select a thought that you think sounds cool, only to realize that it negatively impacts some other aspect of your build that you really don't want to be at a deficit. Luckily, you can spend an additional skill point to unlearn a given thought, which means you're never really stuck with something if you really don't like how it impacts your build. At the same time though, experience is finite, so you really don't want to throw away skill points on unnecessary respeccing if you can avoid it. For my playthrough, I ended up only unlocking 6 of the potential 12 Thought Cabinet slots, simply because I didn't want to quote-unquote waste my skill points on something that might have negatively impacted the abilities I wanted to focus on. Instead, I ended up spending most of my skill points on direct skill augmentation, which gave me a much more direct and understandable positive impact to my build. I really do want to explore the Thought Cabinet in greater detail in future playthroughs, but for my first one, especially when I first started playing, I just didn't want to mess up any more than I already was simply by playing the game. At this point, you might be wondering why I felt like I was messing up simply by playing the game. Well, the answer to that is, unlike any other game I've played, Disco Elysium presents you with a series of situations and dialogue choices that are oftentimes really bad, morally questionable options, none of which may feel particularly good in any given situation. I've mentioned it before, but in most RPGs, I tend to play a good guy character, the proverbial knight in shining armor, a person who saves the day and puts others before himself, a true hero, if you will. As I went into my playthrough of Disco Elysium fairly blind, I was ready to play the game exactly like I would any other RPG. That is, I was ready to become the hero of the story. Only, what you'll notice very early on is that you are most certainly not a hero in Disco Elysium, as when you first start playing the game, you're suffering from amnesia and have just recently completed an alcohol and drug-infused bender that truly shows you are a train wreck of a human being. This was a bit of a kick in the gut for me, because no matter what I did, I felt like I was a pretty horrible person, at least at the outset of the game. Every time I spoke to someone, I received some new information that let me know just how badly I had acted the week prior to waking up with amnesia. And despite my best efforts to apologize for my actions and get back into everyone's good graces, just like in real life, your prior actions have a long-lasting impact on the way people perceive you. Now, here's where things get a bit trippy, because at the same time you're trying to figure out how to pull your life back together and make amends for what you had done to people in the real world, your internal psyche is constantly interjecting its own thoughts that may or may not steer you in a positive direction. And that psyche is made up of each of the 24 sub-skills that you could potentially assign skill points to at character creation, as well as whenever you gain a skill point through playing the game. And it is the allocation of those skill points and the general level of each sub-skill that will influence how your personal internal monologue communicates with you throughout the game. That might sound confusing, and I will admit, when I first started playing, I was super confused at where all of these different thoughts were coming from, so let me explain. You know how in most games you need to pass certain skill checks in order for certain things to happen? Take a game like Baldur's Gate 3, where depending on your class, race, and skill proficiencies, you may receive a dialogue option that otherwise isn't available to other players. Well, in Disco Elysium, you have the same kind of thing, with the 24 sub-skills acting as the main way your character will be presented with different options as you play the game. To illustrate the mechanic a bit more directly, let's take a look at a hypothetical example. Assuming you're speaking with a bouncer at a bar who won't let you get inside because you're not on the proverbial list. Depending on how you've allocated points to your sub-skills, a number of different thoughts might pop into your head. Let's say you put some points into the perception sub-skill. In that case, the perception part of your subconscious might chime in and say something like, you should take a peek at the list and see if you can find a name that you can use instead of your own. And let's say you put some points into physical instrument, which is a measure of your overall physicality in the game. That part of your subconscious might chime in with something like, don't listen to that guy, meaning perception. Just punch the bouncer in the mouth, grab the list, and scream at the top of your lungs, "That's disco, baby!" But let's also say you haven't put any points into authority, which is a way to encourage people to bend to your will. In that instance, the authority part of your subconscious might not say anything because its overall skill level is too low to pass the conversation check for that particular encounter. In practice, this means that you're often trying to balance a number of different, potentially conflicting internal viewpoints, and it's up to you to decide how to proceed with any given situation. It also means that you will almost immediately become curious about how different scenarios could play out if you decided to invest your skills in a different way, which, if you're like me, will make you want to play the game using a different build, even if you haven't completed your current playthrough yet. The degree of variability here is immense, and it's not hyperbole to suggest that the number of permutations in dialogues, choices, and general internal monologues is so vast that there is no way to truly see everything there is to see in the game without spending hundreds of hours playing and replaying the title. Beyond the internal monologue, which attempts to direct you to one of several different options while also providing the ability to actually talk to yourself and receive additional information, your overall sub-skill allocations will also impact which dialogue actions you can take and to what degree they may be successful when speaking with other people. Going back to our bouncer example, after considering the various internal monologue dialogues you received, you may be presented with an option to knock the bouncer out and step over his body as you enter the bar. Well, that option might be marked as a skill check, which depending on your skill allocation may be easier or harder to complete successfully. The good news is that the game displays the likelihood of success as a percentage, so if you see something like 70% or higher, you know you have a pretty good chance of being successful. If, however, you see a much lower percentage, you know it might be risky to proceed. Now, these skill checks come in two flavors. White skill checks, which can be repeated in the future if you fail, and red skill checks, which are one-time things that, if you fail, you'll never be able to try again. I've got to say, I loved this aspect of the game, as every time I faced a red skill check, even for situations that appeared to be fairly innocuous, I felt a legitimate sense of anxiety because I really didn't want to mess something up with an errant poor dice roll. In some dialogues, you can simply back out and come back to that red check when you've had an opportunity to augment the sub-skill that the red check is dependent on. But in other situations, you need to pick from one of a couple different red skill check options in order to proceed with the game, and the potential of failure is very real. When presented with that situation, some people might decide to save scum in order to win the check, so to speak, but I have to urge you to not do that. Disco Elysium, perhaps more than any other game I've played, responds to both success and failure in interesting, often comical ways, and I loved how your unique combination of successes and failures are ultimately what makes you the person you are by the end of the game. Sure, you could save and reload to get the quote-unquote best possible outcome every time, but doing that would rob you of one of the best experiences of playing the game, which is how you respond to the numerous failures you'll encounter as you play the game. Interestingly, because you do have limited skill points at your disposal, your overall build as you play the game will likely not be sufficient for many of the situations you find yourself in. Luckily, the game also has an equipment system, which in the context of Disco Elysium is represented by different articles of clothing, like shoes, hats, glasses, and jackets, as well as different tools that you can potentially use in different situations, like a flashlight, bolt cutters, or a police notebook. Each piece of equipment often adds points to a certain set of subskills, while also reducing points in other subskills, and as you play the game, you'll often find yourself switching your clothes to improve your chance of success at various skill and dialogue checks. There's a pretty good number of clothing options available in the game, simply by exploring the environment, and there are even more options you can buy from various shops and individuals spread around the game world, so you should have a pretty broad range of options to tweak your build even beyond any skills you may have allocated points to. Now, the observant amongst you might have noticed that I've spoken a lot about dialogue options, and the reason for that is the majority of the game is composed of dialogue, whether with other people, or with your own internal subconscious, or with inanimate objects that most likely shouldn't be talking with you, but like I mentioned before, Disco Elysium is not like most other games. If you don't like reading or listening to a ton of dialogue, this is most certainly not the game for you, because in many ways, you can think of Disco Elysium as being a form of interactive visual novel, and there is a truly mammoth amount of text and dialogue to experience in the game. The good news is that the writing is absolutely superb, and is perhaps the best writing I've ever experienced in a video game. But the fact is, if you're looking for a super action-packed experience, Disco Elysium is not it. Anyway, I could go on and on about Disco Elysium, its internal mechanics, the game's quest system, and how everything integrates together throughout the course of playing the game, but to do that would be to rob you of the experience of playing the game yourself. I think I've given just enough info to wet your whistle, so to speak, while still allowing plenty of opportunity to learn more about the game yourself, because from my perspective, that's one of the hidden benefits of playing the game blind. Because you're an amnesiac, and because your interactions and ultimately you as a person are defined entirely by your actions, the fact that you don't know what's going on when you sit down to play the game is a direct analog of your player character's predicament, and that feeling of isolation, anxiety, and helplessness is something that surprisingly makes the game even more fulfilling to experience and decipher. That being said, I do have some thoughts about some of the more specific aspects of the game, and to start, we're going to talk about the graphics. The graphics in Disco Elysium have a painterly, almost watercolor vibe about them, where everything is a bit less high definition than what you might expect from many computer and video games, with broad brushstrokes literally making up a lot of the game world and character portraits that you'll encounter. And I've got to say, the game looks phenomenal as a result. Like I've been mentioning, Disco Elysium is truly different from most other games, and in many respects is more of a work of art than a simple interactive gaming experience. The artistic quality of the title is evident across the entirety of the experience, but most certainly is also directly visible in the game's overall presentation, which makes it feel like you're experiencing a bleak world filled with downtrodden and oppressed individuals, and the visual aesthetic directly contributes to that overarching theme. Put simply, the game looks great. Moving on to the sound and music in the game is all superb, and the music in particular does a terrific job of meshing with and enhancing the situations playing out on the screen, without ever taking center stage itself. You know how in some games the music is bombastic and several different themes might play over the course of your playthrough that become so well known that you want to listen to that music outside of the game? Well, Disco Elysium's music is most certainly not that, and is instead understated in comparison to the rest of the game. Which, by the way, feels entirely by design, because the situations you'll face in Disco Elysium are not epic world-impacting situations. Everything in Disco Elysium is much more quaint and personal, and as a result, the music is much more subdued than what you might hear in other RPGs. In this instance, that design decision is a good one, because the music here is perfect within the context of the game. The other aspect of the sound we need to talk about is the voice acting, which was added as part of Disco Elysium's Final Cut release, or at least expanded upon as part of Disco Elysium's Final Cut release. And I've got to say, the voice acting here is pretty darn great, with a ton of nuanced performances, with my favorite by far being the voice of your various subconscious thoughts, which I thought was simply excellent. The majority of the rest of the voice acting is great too, with the voice work for your partner, Kim Kitsuragi, being another standout. That said, there are some performances that are a bit less nuanced, or feel a bit more like a caricature rather than the rest of the performances, which are really great, but there's nothing here that warrants a true complaint. Overall, the sound and music for Disco Elysium is top-notch, and is an incredible enhancement to the overall experience. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as an amnesiac police officer who, after a prolonged period of alcohol and drug use that has left you without any form of memory, is faced with the prospect of trying to solve a murder case without any of the prerequisite skills that you would expect a normal, functioning person to have. Hopefully you can pull yourself together enough to solve the case in front of you, but if not, hey, at least you tried. Maybe. Okay, before anyone jumps down my throat to complain about the complete lack of story exposition here, let me explain. I cannot and do not want to give you any additional details about the story, simply because discovering the story of Disco Elysium is one of the joys of the game, and because everyone's build will cause the story to play out in any number of different ways, trying to tell you about my story might be entirely different than what your story ends up being. So rather than do that and rob anyone of the joy of experiencing the various narrative beats yourself, I'd rather not say much of anything specific about the plot of the game. What I will say, though, is that the story is superb, and I loved every aspect of it, from the political undertones and overtones that remained prevalent throughout the game, to the individual interactions with different characters who may appear to be minor players, but eventually turn out to be incredibly impactful to the overall narrative, to the various twists and turns that the plot takes before it reaches its eventual conclusion. Everything about the story is phenomenal, and it constantly kept me guessing as I played the game. And even beyond the general plot for the game, the degree of choice prevalent in the game borders on insane, as I truly felt like the story and every dialogue I had with other characters was perfectly tailored to my specific actions and interactions, more so than nearly any other game I've played. I can't fathom the amount of effort that was required to create such a deep, engaging, choice-driven story, but I'm incredibly grateful to the development team for their efforts. The bottom line is, the story in Disco Elysium is incredible, and that's not even mentioning the overall quality of the writing, which, similar to the visuals, is more art than game. I don't know that I've ever played a game with such a level of quality in the overall writing, and regardless of whether the game was going for comedy, dread, mystery, or any other emotion, it hit the mark perfectly. A truly amazing achievement. Moving on to the playability and controls, we already talked extensively about the framework for the game, so we're not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to touch upon briefly are the game's controls, which are absolutely perfect for an interactive, narrative-focused RPG experience. The entire game can be played solely with your mouse, with the left click being used to interact with people and objects in the environment, and the right click being used to highlight different hotspots that can potentially be interacted with, and that's pretty much it. The overall controls here are streamlined to such a degree that it makes the game feel even more like an interactive piece of fiction, and I loved it. For those of you who prefer hotkeys and keyboard inputs though, you do have a bunch of different shortcuts you can use to bring up different menus and windows, like your skills view, your quest list, and other interface elements. But beyond that, this is mostly a mouse-driven affair, and it's designed to be 100% modern, which makes the game feel incredible to control. Otherwise, like I mentioned earlier, I don't want to give away all of the game's secrets, because I truly want anyone who's interested to experience the game for themselves. There are a couple of items I probably should mention though, that I haven't mentioned previously, simply because they help paint a broader picture of the overall structure of the game. For one, I mentioned in passing the game's quest list, which in the context of Disco Elysium presents itself as a pseudo-task list with items to be checked off as you complete them. For the most part, quests in Disco Elysium are very personal kinds of experiences, much like the rest of the game, in that there aren't epic, world-shaking implications to any quest you'll encounter throughout the game. Instead, each individual quest is much smaller in scope, but because of the depth of each character and world interaction and the overall world building at play, you never feel like these quests are simple check-the-box activities. They all feel meaningful in the overall context of the game, even if their overall impact is limited in comparison to what you might see in other games. Those quests, by the way, might persist for several in-game days, as not every task that you receive is cut and dried. As you play Disco Elysium, you'll encounter different situations that require you to be in a certain place at a certain time, and occasionally on a certain day, which is an interesting way of infusing some higher stakes to the overall experience. From what I understand, there are 10 days potentially available to you to complete the game, but the total number of days spent before you personally beat the game is highly variable. I think I beat the game on day 7, and I pretty much did every quest I found in the process. But there are undoubtedly more quests that I didn't discover, and there were some quests where I ended up being too late for a given interaction, which made things play out differently than they otherwise could have. This, as with your overall character build, never felt like I was missing out on something. It simply meant that subsequent playthroughs would have more to experience, which from my perspective is a good thing. Before moving on, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that I did encounter what I believe was a bug in one of the quests, which prevented me from progressing despite the fact that for all intents and purposes, it seemed like I should have been able to progress that specific quest. No spoilers here obviously, but it seemed like because I did a certain sequence of events in a specific order that deviated from what the game expected, I locked myself out of progressing with one of my quests. This wasn't a huge deal at the end of the day, and across the entirety of my playthrough, I encountered this issue literally only a single time, which honestly might have been my fault to begin with. I mention it simply to say that because of how much variability there is in the game, it is possible you might encounter a similar issue depending on your own build, actions, and interactions. I don't think there are any glaring bugs here, at least based on my own personal experience, but it's just something to keep in mind. Otherwise, the game controls great, plays great, and is simply amazing to experience. It is so good that I immediately want to play more of it. Just talking about it makes me want to play more. I fear I may be addicted, but honestly, considering how good Disco Elysium is, that addiction is totally worth it. So what is our verdict on Disco Elysium? Well, the fact is, Disco Elysium is one of the most unique role-playing experiences I've ever encountered. And it is also one of the best role-playing experiences I've ever played. Put simply, this is one of the best written, most thought-provoking games in history, and as such is undoubtedly going to be a future inductee into our pantheon of classic gaming. I cannot speak highly enough about the game. If you've played it before, you already know. If you haven't played it already, consider this your invitation to rip the band-aid off and dive into one of the most engaging and distinct RPG titles that has ever been created. I promise you, it'll be worth your time. That was our episode on Disco Elysium. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, you guys know how to do that. I have my X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. We have our Discord server, and of course, there's always Patreon. Feel free to reach out in any way you like. I will be there. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is almost certainly going to be a ranking of our mediocre mentions and footnotes. I think that's what we're going to do next in a couple weeks. We'll see if that shifts, but that's what I'm thinking right now. And we will be back in a couple weeks with that episode. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. And sometimes the games of today are true future classics. Goodbye, everyone.